Find out now what's new at Majestic. Link context. Related sites. Keyword generator. Discover more at majestic.com.
Hi, welcome back. We're here with Jamie Alberico, who's just finished talking about rendering or why your perfectly optimized content doesn't rank. This was a great presentation, Jamie. Thanks very much.
Thank you so very much for having me. Absolutely delighted.
So now we're live. This is a Q&A session, so feel free to ask your questions in the question section. There's also a chat, and we'll just give you a quick bit of information on the poll that we had going on during the conference. It looks like about 6% of people don't know whether or not there's any GS on their site. 12% say that it's all GS, and 82% say yes, a few components. So it looks like pretty much everyone here probably has some JavaScript going on. And so it's going to be extremely interesting to see what the questions are and what they can do with that.
Absolutely. The latest stats from W3 showed 96.9% of sites using some JavaScript elements.
So to get to our questions, the first question we had comes from the recorded session that we just went through. How does Google render audio searches?
So this is two different ways of looking at it. We could either look at how audio searches are parsed once they're made. If you've ever had a Google Home Mini or got one of the really fun box kits where you build your own home, you'll get to learn that they actually transcribe that and use it that way. When it comes to searching for audio content, Googlebot doesn't have ears yet, so it's going to use a parsed out version of it, best understanding that it has. I would highly recommend, if you have a podcast, you have a video, transcripts are lovely. It's not just about search engines. This is about accessibility. Users who are hearing impaired or visually impaired greatly benefit from these things. So having transcripts available, useful for real humans, and also since Googlebot doesn't have technical ears, you give it a very clear idea of what your content's about, particularly if you tend to use euphemisms, if you talk a little quickly, jumble words, make mistakes, as I do. It's useful to help get that little clarification in there. Get your cheat sheet, use that schema.
The next question is, what is a simple and practical way for identifying rendering issues? Is there a tool you prefer? Or are there good tools for analyzing your website for technical and crawl errors?
So here's the thing with rendering issues. They have a tendency to exist. Each script has a probability of failing. So it's going to look like quantum weirdness. What I'll say, your best tool is listening to people. When someone says, hey, this was broken for me, or you go to Search Console and you see, wow, my site of 800 pages uses hreflang tags, but only 3 hreflang tags are detected. That gives you a strong marker that had prematurely closed and rendering issues are afoot. When you see mobile usability issues that you can't reproduce, another strong marker that there are rendering issues afoot. Google's very good about this rendering process. They've actually upped their game significantly since they came out in 2018 and were like, we need you to give us special versions. Now instead, they're extremely aggressive with their cache. When you do a live test in Search Console using the URL inspector, that bypasses all of the cache that they have in play. So when you see a high resource unavailability, that may not accurately reflect what Google's getting. So look at the version before you do a live test. It's manual process to go through. I would say start with that high level. Look for key markers missing, like your internationalization. Look for mobile usability issues. There is really no third-party tool that's going to be magic. I love both Screaming Frog, No Chrome plugin. Stop with the plugin. Stop it. It's mucking up your tests, okay? When you do any kind of test, when you've got a plugin in play, that's impacting your results. Please don't do that. But you want to use a source of truth. You have those available. Chromium is available. You can run Lighthouse locally using a node instance, and that will actually catch some of these for you. Don't necessarily go with a third-party tool. These things are inconsistent, difficult to track.
Okay. Sort of building on that, hiding your JS version to Google to avoid rendering, is that a good idea? You mentioned this a little bit in the conference itself.
That's dynamic rendering, and I beg of you not to double your tech debt with half the visibility. In theory, yeah, it's great. It's useful, but no, it actually causes more blind spots and difficulties than it will provide you with value. Google's extremely aggressive in its caching. So they actually don't even pay attention to your cache control modifier anymore. They're looking for an E tag or a if modified since. I can't remember the name of that, guys. It's very early in the morning. But if they have a copy of that that's viable, they'll use it when they render. Don't do this dynamic thing. I promise you, the number of sites that I've helped out who had dynamic rendering and had substantial parity issues they weren't aware of, because unless you have QAs who are out there doing twice the testing, you're writing twice the test cases, you have blind spots. Use a single version for all users. If you can do something like progressive rehydration, React has that built in, opting for an intersection observer. You're going to load what matters when it matters, and that's easier for everyone involved.
That's good advice. You just mentioned React. Here's a question about JavaScript platforms and frameworks. What has been the most difficult one to work with? And were there any positives about using it?
All of them. All of them are tempestuous in their own ways. What I will say consistently is a lot of people think they have the most recent version of the library in place and that everything is up to date. That's not always true. So, we're using the most recent version of Phantom.js. I'm going to refer to you, no detriment to you, much love. But the original version of Phantom.js did this thing where if you weren't a returning user, they would add a parameter to the end of the URL, which meant Googlebot was always encountering a redirect when requesting assets because, well, it's stateless. It never showed up as a returning user. The devs on that particular project were like, but we have the most recent version. Well, the thing is, they had the most recent version of 1.4.3, whatever. Actually, I had upgraded to 2. So you need to do fresh installs and pieces like that, making sure the libraries are up to date. Always try and, regardless of which platform you have, try and leverage what's native in the framework as opposed to shoehorning in a third party.
You mentioned in your presentation that Google will rate or limit CPU consumption. Is there a limit, a concrete limit? If my website does well in Lighthouse performance tests, is it safe to say I don't have any CPU rating limitation issues?
That CPU limitation rating. So say someone pushed code to production that accidentally had an infinite loop. If it didn't limit consumption, that asset from Google is going to be sat there in perpetuity in this infinite loop. That doesn't benefit you. It doesn't benefit them. They're very, very patient. This is unlikely, but be aware of it, particularly if you're using like a document.write and you're constantly adding in more things to your rendered HTML into that DOM. It has a limit. It has a cutoff.
If you can give your top 3 development tips related to SEO for the future, what would you say they would be?
Is that for working with developers or to developers? All right. Either way, make allies. As a tech SEO, I can promise you I don't know it all. And even if I learned it all, there would be an update. A library would be deprecated. Something would change. So it's really rather futile to think that you do. So rather working collaboratively, listening, asking questions, rather than prescribing exactly the answer you want, you give that user story. as an SEO, I want to progressively render my content in order to provide a fast user experience or a quick user engagement time frame. Give stories, give your acceptance criteria. So collaborate, define success. What does it actually mean when we've done things successfully? Define how we're measuring it. If you don't define it, then no one really has an idea if they succeeded or failed. No one likes it as a human, and it doesn't make for good development.
That works from both sides. The server-side rendering combined with single-page applications, is this a good choice? And what are the limitations of this combination?
Server-side rendering is fine. Basically, you're saying, I'm going to go ahead and execute all the JavaScript. When I say fine, that also assumes that your servers have the capacity to go ahead and do that every time. It's a bit much. Nothing wrong with it. Far, far better than doing a dynamic.
Okay. Do you think that SEOs need to have a decent grasp of the different JS frameworks and how they work? Or can you still do great SEO and get away with not knowing much about JS?
Okay, you jumped the shark there. There's a difference between knowing the nuances of the 150 million, like, play a game. Pick a word, be like couch.js and see if it's real. It probably is real. So there's a difference between knowing every framework and their nuances, which you should not have to do. You are not the best resource there to do these things. Even if you understand them, someone else knows the rest of the stack that plugs into better than you. And not knowing JS at all. Do you need to understand JS? Yes. Do you need to be able to write JS? No. Not required.
And one final question here. What would be a good resource, in your opinion, for learning more about crawling from the perspective of Google? I'm going to answer that one really quick. I think it'll probably be the last event in We Love SEO Virtual Summit tomorrow, because we have John Mueller and Martin Schlitt who are coming just to talk about that. So Jamie might have another suggestion.
My suggestion is go to that. Also, if you go ahead and go on to, so Google 2 years ago went from being, let me rephrase that. The webmaster team went from being this rather isolated little group over yonder to being part of the developers group. So Google developers, webmasters are beneath that. And that means Martin being brought on has worked to create an amazing amount of documentation. And in technical documentation, it's very literal. So if you go in there and start reading those docs, you'll be surprised how forthcoming they are. Rather than getting all of your information and feeds from wonderful blogs and publications, also take time to review the developer documentation because it's less open to interpretation and it gives you a clear way of testing, confirming, and learning more.
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie. That's all for today. We know that we can catch you on Twitter at jammer_votes and that we can also connect with you here on this platform by sending you a message. The next event today will be a keynote by Lily Ray on adapting to Google's criteria for high authority top ranking websites in 2020, which will start in about 15 minutes. So if you're looking for something to do while you're waiting, you can go see the exhibitor pages. You can participate in the contest under gamification to win prizes, or you can join the backstage discussion forum. Thanks, Jamie, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much. Guys, everyone go see Lily Ray. She's phenomenal. It's a pleasure to chat with you today.